Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our today's session at Maqtabkhana. Today we have a very important guest, Professor Joseph Kaminski, and we are very grateful to him for taking some time from his busy schedule to have this session with us. Today we will be discussing with him his latest book, that is Islam, Liberalism, and Ontology. We at Maqtabkhana believe that this book is of tremendous importance for students of not only international relations, but of Islam, comparative politics, and political ideology, and so on. Especially, Bangladesh is a vibrant country with problems and tensions associated with Islam, secularism, liberalism, and Islamism. For Bangladeshi audience, I think it would be tremendously helpful to have a better understanding of the problems that we are dealing at present. So Professor Kaminski is Associate Professor of International Relations at the International University in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Sarajevo. And again, I would like to thank him and ask him to begin his address today.
All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Thank you guys for this wonderful opportunity to present today. I'm very excited about being able to present my book today. I think it's a very relevant topic for many reasons. I just have to forewarn you that I just lectured for an hour and a half of class, and I'm fasting, so my mouth is dry, and I'll try not to talk too fast, and I'll try not to slur my words because my mouth is already feeling like it's sticking together. But I'm really happy, as I said, that you invited me for this talk today, and I'm gonna present basically the outline of my book. Can you guys see that screen? Can you see the screen I'm showing you? The PowerPoint. Can somebody comment on that, please? Ishraq, can you tell me, can you guys all see the screens?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure, because my last presentation, I had problems with that. So, look, I'm going to talk about the book. Okay, I'm going to talk about the book, but I also, towards the end, after I finish this presentation, I would like to do something a little different, where I'd like to connect it to your specific case in Bangladesh, right? Because, you know, theorizing at an abstract level is fun to do in the institution. It's a good way to make a living, right, to be a philosopher. But in reality, if we want to take our work and apply it, we need to look at specific cases. And we have an audience of people here from Bangladesh today. And I think you guys are dealing with your own internal political issues. And I would like to hear your comments and what you think of what I said and what potential paths forward there can be for those who consider themselves to be religious Muslims who want to see Islam at least have a place in the public sphere, right? So without any further ado, let us begin. So the title of the book is Islam, Liberalism, and Ontology, Critical Reevaluation. This is my second book. It was published my first book was published in 2017. It's called The Contemporary Islamic Governed State of Reconceptualization, where I offer a normative model of a potential starting point for conceptualizing a contemporary Islamic governed state. It was published by Palgrave, and it did pretty well. I got good reviews on it. But this book, I feel, is more theoretically rigorous. The last book I like to say was sort of Kaminskiism, where I was sort of like talking about my own philosophies on what a good Islamic governed state would look like. And this one's a little bit more of a technical work of analytic political philosophy is the technical term we would use for what I try to do in this project. So let me lay it out for you and get started here today. So what is this book doing? All right. The main argument pushed forth throughout this manuscript simply is that liberalism, both Enlightenment or political, and Islam operate on fundamentally different baseline assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The stark differences regarding the overarching ontology of both discourses, in my opinion, makes reconciling them in any meaningful way very problematic. General lower order similarities between Islam and liberalism, I argue, should be seen as primarily incidental rather than indicative of any deeper discursive congruence. All right? The work also seeks to open the door to more serious scholarly inquiry regarding an alternative discursive framework, namely that which specifically falls under this umbrella of what is called communitarianism, which should not be understood as communism. Please, it's not the same as communism. A lot of people ask me that, you're saying Islam is with communism? No, I'm not. Right? So we'll talk more about that when we get to that chapter. And I believe this will help policymakers and theorists help better theorize ways to conceptualize meaningful debates may transpire in Muslim majority societies, especially those transitioning out of autocracy or civil war. Arguing that Islam and liberalism are not reconcilable at a higher order level is not necessarily a radical claim to make. Right? Many other people have made this basic argument before, and some have recently sought to challenge it, but this is the position that's been held by many people. The provocative Bernard Lewis, right? Frankly, yet reasonably, I argue, commented that it wasn't about whether liberal democracy is compatible with Islamic fundamentalism, which clearly does not. He further argues isn't even compatible with Islam itself, a non-fundamentalist version. And he further notes that, quote, liberal democracy, however far it may have traveled, however much it may have been transformed, is itself a product of the West. So what differentiates? So what's the point of writing this, right? Well, I argue that what differentiates my work from other works that have simply alluded to Lewis's point is that my specific project aims to offer real critical analysis and deep investigation of the basic categories that comprise Islam and liberalism via a clearly defined methodological mode of inquiry, right? Rather than just making this basic point via a spattering of references and anecdotes, this book actually hopes to address this issue in a meticulous and measured manner via primary and canonical sources that comprise each discourse. So it ultimately hopes to serve as a useful asset for those studying comparative political theory or the relationship between international relations, politics, and religion. And, the book is somewhat technical. I don't think it's a perfect read for a first or undergrad class, but for a senior level undergraduate advanced seminar or graduate seminar, I think a lot can be drawn from this. So that was the audience in mind when I wrote this book. However, even though it has a more advanced audience in mind, I feel that anybody who has a real interest in Islam and politics can read this and get something out of it, right? So it's not at such a technical level that only people who really are experts can get it, but it's also not a kindergarten book, right? Okay, so one of the first things we have to address is what I call the Leviathan is liberalism, right? I didn't use this term in the book, but it came to me afterwards, but I think it's important to think of it this way. In a world of competing discourses for hegemony, right, at least in terms of being seen as the appropriate mode of political inquiry by policymakers, political actors, and academics alike, liberalism and anti-foundationalism have, to varying degrees, all but won out in recent times. Fred Dallmeyer postulates that, quote, political liberalism has achieved virtual canonical status, edging out nearly all other competing ideologies and perspectives. Others have argued that many liberals have grown very complacent within their philosophical frameworks, even when confronted by the shortcomings of the discourse. And they seem to just sort of accept liberalism as what it is, right? This is what I say here. I have this quote from Dallmeyer, who really is a great guy. I got to meet him in 2017 before my first book came out at Notre Dame. And he's a terrific scholar. He argues that, and this is from one of his later books. It came out in 2004. Fred Dallmeyer has been around for a very long time. He's 92 at this point. I think he's still active to some degree. He says that at this point, instead of preserving its elan, liberalism's original critique or mode of critical questioning is in danger of turning into a fixed answer or an unquestioned dogma itself. To put it another way, liberty is changing from a liberating promise into a vested status or privileged possession. So sort of I argue that what's happening here is liberalism is becoming exactly what it was critical of in the first place. Another sort of blindly deferring to tradition, right? And this is what liberalism was critiquing. So liberalism has replaced that tradition as being the status quo discourse that, of course it's right. It's liberalism. What else is there, right? And this is sort of the same argument that monarchists made prior to liberalism, right? So I argue that in my last book that certain stylistic changes to certain specific religious practices is really only the tip of the iceberg when trying to consider the genuine deep incompatibilities that I argue between Islam and liberalism at what you call the second order level. This work digs deeper into the iceberg, and it looks at multiple thinkers representative of the liberal tradition specifically. Well, I mean, in the Enlightenment tradition, because Thomas Hobbes is hardly a liberal, but I look at Enlightenment thinkers and those who eventually would become liberal, right? So Thomas Hobbes, then we go into Locke, Mill, and the John Rawls, who most certainly would be fit under the categorization of liberal, right? So This book aims to be a work, as I said, of comparative political theory, and it draws heavily from Andrew March's earlier claims regarding what the nature of comparative political theory actually is. So many of you guys might be familiar with this name. Andrew March just wrote that book, The Caliphate of Man. It's that book about popular sovereignty, and it's a terrific book. And I interact with Professor March quite a bit. I think he's a really wonderful scholar, and he's much better than most of you guys even probably think, because before he wrote this book and before he got into this topic, at the beginning part of his career, he really was mapping out the trajectory of what comparative political theory would be. So in the late 2009s and 2010s, Andrew March was publishing stuff, basically laying, like I said, he was like setting the discourse, writing methodological work that was published in some of the very top journals, right? So I'm drawing from that earlier work when I make these points. According to March, the heart of the comparative political theory enterprise is what he describes as principled value conflict. Exploring its normative implications is an appropriate task of engaged political theory and could easily be made the centerpiece for the comparative political theory project more generally. He describes comparative political theory as a justificatory exercise that differs from the traditional concerns of hermeneutics, discourse analysis, genealogy, or intellectual history to the extent that it is concerned with a particular form of normative argumentation or justification. For March, comparative political theory does not pretend to be disinterested or value neutral. It is openly concerned with justifying certain normative principles from different philosophical, ethical, or religious foundations. Marx's own method of conjecture follows three fundamental premises that I try to draw from when I structured this book. One, arguing from the more orthodox sources, then moving on to the less orthodox ones with trying to prove a point. Two, engaging in transparency and restraint when making arguments or claims. And three, finally, and perhaps most importantly, showing sympathy for the text in question being analyzed, right? So it means trying to speak in the terms and to articulate the position of the author you're critiquing in a way he would present his own argument. So it doesn't mean starting off by saying, John Locke's stupid, I don't like him, here's why, right? That's not how you go about the comparative political theory method. What you would do is you would lay out his argument as concisely and correctly as you could, in a way that he would say, yes, I agree with that. And then after you lay that out, then you would start offering your critiques of it. But the key is to present the text in the way the author had it in mind. I find a great deal of merit in this approach because it makes no sense to base one's arguments about liberalism or Islam on sources seen as overly reformist or outside the mainstream. This means first engaging, as I said, with the more traditional conservative scholars. However, this does not mean simply dismissing or outright rejecting anybody who's reformist or holds an unorthodox position, right? Ikhtilaf within Islam is something that goes back to the very beginnings. So it doesn't mean just saying none of this stuff matters except the mu'tamad, right? But it does mean that recognizing that these positions ought not to be the one to use to articulate the more general ontological claims of particular discourse when discussing the theological and eschatological foundations of Judaism, for example, right? So we're talking about Jewishness. Does one begin with their explanation via reference to Moshe Rosen's Jews for Jesus movement, which was founded in 1973 and posits that Jesus Christ was the promised Messiah of the Jewish people? Or does it begin with Maimonides, the Talmud, and other earlier doctrine, right? So obviously, you would start with Maimonides when trying to outline Judaism's basic principles, rather than somebody who was seen as extremely outside the mainstream. So when you understand it through that perspective, you can understand a little bit better the sense it would make for what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So briefly, just a table of content outline, and then the rest of this talk will sort of follow logically the order of the book. And then we'll open the floor for questions. You sort of saw the first chapter already. That was basically the introduction I just laid out, except I really summarized it. The work will go on to give a brief outline of the historical development of liberalism and its Enlightenment origins. It will then look more closely at the inextricability of Enlightenment liberalism from political liberalism. This is an essential connection to make in order to fully codify one of the main arguments being pushed in this work, namely that no matter how one frames liberalism, it is inescapable from a larger Weltanschauung or larger comprehensive doctrine. If this is the case, as I intend to show, then no matter what level one seeks to postulate liberalism at, it remains intimately connected to a unique comprehensive doctrine that at its core is fundamentally different than Islam. I will then address the question of how one can speak of Islam as a unified subject of inquiry despite a multiplicity of local traditions, and I draw heavily from the works of Talal Asad and Overmyer Andrew when discussing this, as well as prototype theory, and even the thought of Ludwig Wittgenstein in his discussion of family resemblances. The concluding chapters will begin the more explicit comparative analysis, looking at how Islam and liberalism as discourses more broadly construed differ on questions related to human rights, moral epistemologies, the role of religion in the public sphere, and more general approaches to legal discourse. These differences will be rigorously explored by primary and canonical sources, constitutive of both Islam and liberalism. The concluding section of the book will articulate why communitarian modes of thought offer more promise than liberalism for meaningful engagement with liberalism, with Islam, and contemporary social political modes of organization. All right, so I just sort of laid out what we're going to do here today. So chapter 2 is sort of the history chapter. It lays the necessary foundation and groundwork for the argumentation that transpire in the forthcoming chapters. Basically, to summarize this chapter, it argues that liberalism is deeply rooted in the Enlightenment ethos, a Western, not Islamic phenomenon. While early Enlightenment thinkers were not necessarily liberal, and many of them actually were definitely not, one does see a steady move towards liberalism during the 18th century, and in the era of the French and American revolutions, perhaps seeing its height, the Scottish, what is called the Scottish liberal Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment of 1770s. During this time, one sees the emergence of newly constructed concerns with universal human rights and national rights as we move further along the development of international legal scholarship and the more formalization of the nation state as the dominant mode of social political organization. Secularism is described as well in detail in this chapter. It is understood as a development that is connected to the rejection of the church's authority over worldly affairs and the rise of modern scientific inquiry. I emphasize in the chapter that secularization of society and the internalization of secular beliefs are not one and the same. A good deal of evidence actually shows that the vast majority of people still hold strong beliefs in the paranormal and the supernatural. The discrepancy between societal norms and individual beliefs has in fact caused tension and uneasiness amongst many different peoples. While the process of secularization is not uniform and linear, it is something that liberalism, in my opinion, is dependent upon. Finally, centuries before the nation state was ever created, Islam was not only a part of Europe, but it served in many ways as Europe's necessary other, the development that many social theorists have argued is necessary for the formation of group identity. While it might not be easy for the average European or American to say what Europeans and Americans actually are, it is much easier for them to say what they are not. And for the vast majority of these people, what they are not are Muslim. All right, so chapter 3 is when we move into our discussion about different types of liberalism. So this is where we start getting quite technical. And if you guys don't have a background in liberal political theory, this might be a little bit over your heads. I don't know what level you guys are at. I don't know if you're undergraduates or if you study this stuff in universities over there. And quite honestly, most of my students won't understand this either. This is talk that's really sort of at a graduate level, but I'll try to make it sure you guys can understand as best as I can if you're not familiar with these arguments. So chapter 3 sought to give further credence to Charles Taylor's more general argument that liberalism, despite its claims to be a neutral arbiter, ultimately is nothing other than another conception of the good. Daniel Weinstock nicely analyzed Charles Taylor's basic position, commenting that Taylor saw societies that protect, quote, individual rights so that people can lead lives according to their own lights as embodying what he calls, at minimum, a partially historically culturally situated conception of the good, rather than somehow standing above such conceptions. Most of liberalism's contemporary critics have argued that liberalism is something that cannot be understood only in its limited political sense. These people, including myself, argue that liberalism ultimately is a transformative project. All forms of liberalism possess an undeniably transformative character that seek to maximize autonomous individual agency, which itself is the essential feature of Joseph Raz, perhaps the most well-known perfectionist liberal, his understanding of perfectionist liberalism. But political and comprehensive liberalism are not identical. They do share an undeniable familial relation. The chapter aims to show that efforts to fully divorce the two is not possible, as political liberals contend. If political liberalism, as John Rawls suggests, genuinely is not contingent upon any particular comprehensive doctrine, then perhaps there is more room for malleability between political liberalism and Islam. On the other hand, if political liberalism, even if it seeks otherwise, remains rooted in the standard Enlightenment liberal conception of the good life, as this chapter went on to show, then finding a genuine overlapping consensus between a modus vivendi at best is the best hope, and even this becomes more challenging. While pragmatic compromises of this nature have often been essential for the success of liberal toleration-oriented discourses, and liberalism more generally, nonetheless, such accounts fail to account for the moral appeal of genuine toleration, something that liberalism supposedly takes seriously. Inherent within Rawls's iteration of political liberalism, there is a not-so-subtle recognition of what is and what is not acceptable in terms of certain comprehensive doctrines. This, in my opinion, presupposes a certain latent conception of the good, or at least a conception of the not good, which itself I don't think can really be understood without some kind of basic understanding of the good, right? Even if one tries to argue that this declaration is merely a condemnation of what is wrong rather than any kind of positive affirmation of what is right, Rawls's claim that political liberalism is a neutral arbiter regarding competing conceptions of the good and metaphysical truth claims, in my opinion, remains quite dubious. Rawls's reasonableness corollary, which I talk about in more detail in the book, as a prerequisite for public discourse, remains an unresolved and potentially problematic issue, as it potentially excludes many lines of religious-rooted reasoning, or even certain religious discourses more generally a priori. While Samuel Huntington may have made many objectionable points to his Clash of Civilizations argument, one thing that does seem accurate is his depiction of the West's continued misguided belief in the universality of its values and political systems, regardless of one's pre-existent religious beliefs or local customs. Right? So in the Trump era, the West sort of moved away from this and more towards supplanting pliant authoritarian regimes rather than actually promoting democratization in the Middle East. Right? However, even Trump still seemed interested in pushing universal liberal social and economic norms, and often used them as a bludgeon or a cudgel against regimes that it was trying to get back at, such as the Iranian regime, which was always accused of human rights violations. But other regimes, such as the regime right next to you guys in India that violates human rights probably worse than just about anybody, not too much negative talk came from the Trump administration on that, right? So we see that this sort of the game that was played. Mike Pompeo even announced that this was the plan, to sort of pick and choose when to pull out the human rights card and when to just sort of ignore it when it was politically expedient. And this absolutely is not liberalism at all. So, okay, if we're going to talk about liberalism, so chapter 4 is written sort of because I felt obligated. If we're going to talk about liberalisms, then we're also obliged to talk about Islams as well. The question of what is Islam has become increasingly salient in recent decades and has been addressed by a litany of very top-level scholars, including Muhammad Suleiman, Shahab Ahmed, who passed away, as you guys know, shortly before his book came out in 2015, What is Islam? Talal Assad, Ovamir Anjum, who's really one of my dear friends, Michael Gilsonan, and Abu Hamid al-Zain much earlier in the 1970s was even talking about this. Just to mention a few. Can a conclusive, essentialized account of Islam, this unified, singular, discursive meta-tradition be offered? I do not think it can. A multiplicity of interpretations, sects, and dogmas have emerged over the centuries that only the most rigid sectarian partisan would deny still fall somewhere within the broader umbrella that is Islam. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned sort of earlier, a wide range of Islamic scholars over the centuries, including iconic scholars like Imam Shafi, Ibn Qutayba, al-Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah, all understood scholarly disagreement or ikhtilaf as a mercy and a blessing from Allah Azza wa Jal. So if a unified single account of Islam is not feasible, is my entire project itself incoherent? I don't think this is the case either. Otherwise, I've written a book. But this chapter contends that while a unified, conclusive account, discursive account of Islam, with the capital I, Islam as one, may be difficult to provide, it is plausible to offer a coherent account of Islam that will be palatable to most readers. This is what the previous chapter sought to do actually in this discussion of liberalism. And as a matter of fact, this seems to be the case with any expansive ideology or system of belief. While offering a conclusive, singular account may not be possible, one may be able to still offer one that is coherent and plausible. Plausibility, however, does not speak for itself. It needs to be backed with sound argumentation. To bolster my claims about plausibility, this chapter will engage with Ludwig Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblances and the idea of prototype theory, which first emerged in the field of cognitive science a few decades ago. With this in mind, the burden of proof is much lower in demonstrating a plausible and coherent ontology of Islam as possible, as opposed to a definitive one. The bar obviously is significantly higher, if not impossible to meet altogether. Drawing from the likes of Talal Assad, I argue that one can understand Islam in sort of like a giant web. You have primary sources and beliefs that are universally assented to by just about any Muslim. Then you have canonical, legal, and scholarly texts, the Muwatta, Imam Shafi's Risala, etc. Following this secondary level, you have tertiary commentaries and developments by later scholars on these aforementioned canonical discourse-setting works, like the Muwatta and the Risala, as well as works that are accompanied by certain new practices. While these commentaries and their other commentaries, while these commentaries and developments are extremely valuable, nonetheless they are in fact less rudimentary to the overall discourse than the text that they analyze, as we're moving further down the web. Then these tertiary commentaries have their own commentaries and sets of practices that come with them, and so forth and so on. The web loosens the further down you go. Nonetheless, just because these later works are situated more on the periphery of the web, this does not mean that they're not a part of the overall web. Okay, this is a very important point. If you have a web, if you remove too many of these lower down strings of the web, you end up having a situation where you have an overly rigid web that doesn't account for the beautiful mosaic that are all the different movements within Islam. On the other hand, if you make the web too big, it starts to include just about everything, including things that actually are quite un-Islamic, right? We get to some point where we're starting to really embrace positions and arguments that most people would reject. And then you really do move into what Abu Hamid al-Zain critiqued in the first place, that there really is no uniform discourse. So you can't really speak of Islam as unified subject. So the real question for someone like myself is, how big of a web do you make? That is the real unresolved question. What gets counted in this web of essential documents and text and practices, and what gets sort of left more on the periphery? I absolutely am not qualified to engage in that discussion. I'm a political philosopher, not a scholar of Islam or theology, so I will leave that one for you guys. But that to me is the real question: is making how big is the web and what does it contain? Okay, so now that I laid out basically liberalisms and Islams, I move on to sort of the comparative part, right? So this chapter 5, comparing the liberal and Islamic approach to moral epistemology and human rights. This is the first real comparative chapter, right? So this gets pretty technical quickly as well. This chapter first engages with questions related to Islam and liberalism's moral epistemologies. It frames its argument around the thoughts primarily of John Locke, which serves as a fulcrum for comparative analysis. Questions that are explored include: how do societies come to understand morality? And which sources are engaged with in crafting localized and universal moralities? I'd like to begin by pointing out that Locke was a notoriously difficult thinker to pin down on many key issues, especially those related to moral law and natural rights. Locke's moral theory, as outlined in his essay Concerning Human Understanding, presents many formidable challenges, even for his most skilled readers and scholars of Locke. Catherine Wilson eloquently lays out some of these problems, noting that, quote, depending on where in the essay Concerning Human Understanding one looks, the content of morality appears to depend on the Bible, or on the requisite of our fellow humans, or on our personal needs and interests. Our knowledge of moral principles seems to in turn depend on a priori reflection and social learning, religious instruction, and the analysis of terms and sentences or linguistic analysis. Locke's generous attempt to accommodate every moral intuition makes it quite difficult to characterize his doctrines in standard political terms. End quote. I thought it was a really nice way to frame it, because that really is what Locke is. He's really confusing to understand. However, I will offer my own efforts at laying out a plausible, once again, the word plausible, portrayal of Locke's basic moral epistemological positions. Locke's position does not begin with rights per se, but it does hinge upon the obligation of everyone to obey the law of nature, because man represented the divine workmanship of God. This, of course, is a speculative argument that begs the question, where does God explicitly iterate these rights that Locke refers to? The answer is God did not explicitly iterate these rights. He iterated certain laws to follow, according to Locke, that can be derived from the Bible, but for Locke, it appears that no such explicit textual revealed source can be pointed to for rights. This is because natural rights derive from natural law, which itself exists within nature and is readily recognizable by man through his own rational faculties. It is important to point out here that for Locke, divine law and natural law are not at odds. How in the world would Locke ensure this? Well, the answer is quite forward. Locke simply interpreted natural law in a way that was consistent with biblical teachings. At the same time, Locke also made biblical teachings fit within the standard liberal understanding of the world. According to the great scholar Bhikkhu Park, Locke allowed for the liberal worldview to rearticulate Christianity in what he calls, quote, standard liberal idioms. And he achieved this by turning Christianity into a reasonable doctrine, by stripping it of its theological mysteries, reducing its highly complex ethic to a simplified morality of bourgeois reciprocity, and by turning churches into voluntary associations. In essence, Locke made his biblical scriptural interpretations fit within his own iteration of natural law, which Park understood as a simplified morality of bourgeois reciprocity, with a very heavy emphasis on property rights. This is what allowed Locke's theory to accommodate both divine law and natural law at the same time. Now, briefly summarizing the link between God, the law of nature, and how the law of nature comes to be understood by man in Locke's depiction of how we come to understand ethical truths, we find something very interesting. God, who himself is constrained regarding certain moral truths, which exist independent of his will according to Locke, creates the law of nature with the aforementioned restraints in mind, since he can't violate them if he wanted to, and man eventually comes to understand this law of nature via reason. Such laws are understood via antecedent and never via innate imprint, even though we all do possess certain hardwired instincts for other things, such as base physiological urges and animalistic drives. Examples of these for Locke include a desire for food, water, the avoidance of pain, etc. He also believed that we have a natural inclination to seek knowledge, and that we all functioning brains that are normal without defect possess the capacity to learn. This understanding is quite different from the most widely held positions within Islam on how individuals come to understand morality. Within Islam, all knowledge is rooted in the fundamental notion of Allah's oneness, or tawheed. Goodness does not exist outside Allah's will, nor is Allah constrained by anything independent, whatever restrictions he may so choose to place upon himself, which he always, of course, has the ability to lift. This is the mainstream understanding today. Even those few scholars who still cling to certain aspects of Mu'tazilite rationalism rarely, if ever, at least publicly, promote their school's earlier position, which pretty explicitly held that God's will is constrained by moral prerequisites. This is a position that generally lost its currency around 1,000 years ago. The late Palestinian-American philosopher and scholar of comparative religion, Ismail al-Faruqi, argued that Tawheed rests on three core methodological principles, and I think his characterization is very important. First is the rejection of all that does not correspond with reality. Second is the denial of ultimate contradictions. And third is an openness to new or contrary evidence. So for Faruqi, he was interesting because he sort of argued that the problems could be because we're misunderstanding nature or we're misunderstanding the religious text, but it couldn't be because the two were at odds with each other. There was a misunderstanding happening somewhere. It could be textual, it could be our own misunderstanding of science and nature, but it never was an actual real conflict of interest. All right, we can see that authentic Tawheed here necessitates both rational, empirical observations, along with the recognition of God's divine unity. These two cannot be separated. A second part of this chapter, therefore, then looks at the foundations of human rights, as understood in liberal and Islamic moral universes, and shows where the two discourses converge and depart, once again with a pretty heavy focus on John Locke. Regarding the modern notion of rights, Alistair McIntyre interestingly points out that from a purely linguistic perspective, there exists no proper translation from any medieval languages, what we would consider a modern right today. The concept of right, according to McIntyre, lacks any means of expression in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, classical or medieval, before about 1400, let alone one in English or in Japanese, even as late as the mid-19th century. A similar assessment regarding the lack of a concrete notion of universal human rights in antiquity was also expressed by the French Revolution liberal, the great Benjamin Constant. Constant believed one of his actual major contributions to the French Revolution thought was his argument that the French Revolution was the first to really establish this idea of universal human rights in the minds of men. Prior to La Révolution Fracassée, no such concept was really taken seriously by most people. Islam and liberalism at one level are both concerned about the individual. However, the way in which these concerns are articulated differs radically. Kamali, the great Mustafa Hashim Kamali, the Islamic legal scholar at IIUM in Malaysia, asserts that Islam's primary focus is on the individual, but in the sense that it inspires the believer with faith and instills him the qualities of being trustworthy and righteous. This is to suggest that Islam is more deeply concerned with the individual's soul and their spiritual well-being than it is with worldly rights and freedoms. Abdulaziz Sachedina, another one of my favorite contemporary scholars who I had the pleasure of meeting in Turkey 2 years ago, reminds us that, quote, the language of the Islamic juridical tradition is primarily the language of responsibilities and obligations rather than rights or liberties. And Abdulaziz Sachedina is an expert in both Sunnism and Shiism, so he's like talking about everything, right? Within the liberal discourse, the understanding of the individual is one steeped in a somewhat expansive notion of basic rights and liberties. Liberalism does not concern itself with intrinsic qualities such as trustworthiness, righteousness, as moral ends in themselves. The emphasis on responsibilities and obligations noted by Sachedina differs markedly from the liberal juridical and constitutional tradition, which in fact does prioritize liberties and rights. This is the chapter that is perhaps the most important in my opinion, because this is the chapter that I'm now using to develop my new book project, which aims to offer an iteration of what we call Islamic public reason. The project is very in its beginning stages, but this chapter sort of shows why I think this needs to be done. It lays out a few different approaches representative of the mainstream within broader Islamic public reason discourse. Specifically, it critically engages with the arguments of Rawls, Habermas, Jonathan Kwong. Some scholars like Kristen Stokel have argued that political liberalism has thus far only really sought to address either liberal reformist or fundamentalist religious actors, and has actually paid insufficient attention to mainstream traditionalist religious actors, who in fact make up the significant portion of believers across all religious discourses. The main claim pushed in this chapter is that appeals to liberal public reason run into some very serious issues when it comes to satisfying the needs of traditional Muslim actors who seek to fully engage in the public discursive sphere. While there has been a litany of scholarship on liberal approaches to public reason since Rawls's work first came out in the 1970s, the opposite is true regarding non-liberal approach to public reason. This chapter sought to engage with some of the limitations regarding liberal public reason, and how these people who have a worldview of Islam have difficulty expressing themselves in the public sphere under liberal public reason models. Chapter did not aim to show the liberal and Islamic conception of public reason are hopelessly in conflict at all times. Liberal public reason can potentially be operationalized within various domains within the broader Islamic social political discursive sphere, albeit within certain parameters. For example, the University of Toronto law professor Muhammad Fadl has recently argued that within the realm of non-ideal theory, specifically regarding how Islamic judges operationalize public reasoning when applying Islamic law, quote, Rawls's idea of public reason can play an important role in guiding how public reason-minded judges should apply Islamic law when the rules of their legal system require them to do so. I think this is accurate to a large extent. In certain cases, public reason-minded judges can find ways to creatively balance obligatory religious prerequisites with the basic standards of liberal public reason in a way that remains within the fold of Islamic legal thinking, if done correctly. However, by Fadl's own account, public reason-minded judges are only one type of judge. They are not necessarily the default judge or even the correct type of judge. It is questionable as to whether or not most Islamic judges in practice, since we're still talking at the level of non-ideal theory, operate within Rawls's public reason-minded manner when applying Islamic law. While public reason obviously plays a role in shaping a public reason-minded judge's decision, there are undeniably other doctrinal factors that will tint any Islamic judge's reasoning and decision-making processes as well. And I feel that these reasons may run afoul of Rawlsian public reason in certain cases. The same logic can be extended to understanding how individuals engage in public reason more generally. I feel that Fadl downplays this reality in his analysis. In the end, it seems that his iteration of an overlapping consensus between Islam and non-ideal liberal theory is still based upon a certain idealized version of Islam, and perhaps even an idealized version of non-ideal theory. The biggest problem with Fadl's claims is that they minimize the deeper problem posed by the fact that, by his own admission, there cannot be a political or legal place for Islamic law and liberal democracy in Rawls's ideal theory. except to the extent that Islam and Islamic law may play some kind of role in personal and associational lives of Muslims in what is known as a well-ordered society. It's important to remember that non-ideal theory is ultimately rooted in an ideal theory, and that if, as according to Fadl, it seems, quote, obvious, end quote, that Rawls's ideal theory is not compatible with traditional Islamic values and beliefs, then one is already beginning with a relatively shaky foundation for conceptualizing the possibility of Islam within non-ideal theory as well. Fadl's own approach on this matter hinges upon Muslims endorsing conceptions of Islam that are reasonable from a Rawlsian public perspective, which the rest of this chapter argues might be more difficult than it sounds. You'll have to read it for yourself because I can't go into all those details here. But what counts as reasonable and what counts as unreasonable is sort of an unresolved issue still. And quite honestly, I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon because Rawls's understanding of reasonableness has certain prerequisites that go into contradiction with the basic understanding of the Islamic worldview. Specifically, Rawls's argument is that you have to be willing to reject any position you hold if proven wrong. And no practicing Muslim is going to ever reject Islam. Like, that's sort of the root of the problem. So you're already beginning in a situation where you're not going to have people entering the deliberative sphere willing to forsake their religion if proven otherwise. And it's not just Islam that does this, it's all religions. And this is really the problem with public reason, with liberal public reason and religious argumentation. Is there's just certain basic principles that people aren't going to reject or dismiss. Okay? So just the last couple chapters here. Chapter 7 talks about the similarities and differences between Islamic and liberal conceptions of the law. It first offers a brief outline of how fatwa function within substantive Islamic law, touching upon this controversial idea, this closing of the gates of ijtihad, popularized by later Orientalist scholars. It then articulates how Western liberal legal discourses differ from Islamic legal discourses in terms of both purpose and scope. Finally, it will explore the similarity. The chapter actually explores the similarities between the American legal system and classical Islamic legal thought regarding the moral prerequisites for the admissibility of witness testimony in a court of law, drawing from the work of one of my favorite younger scholars, Junaid Qadri, who's a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who I had the pleasure of meeting and getting to hang out with last year when I was in Chicago, because I'm from the Chicago area originally. All right, the overarching argument of this chapter, it aims to promote is that liberal conceptualization of law, at one level, are freer than Islamic law. This is because of greater flexibility that liberal legal conceptions have regarding their own commitment to their own foundational sources rooted in human reasons, not revelation. However, at the same time, I contend that liberal theory is far more limited in scope and less concerned with directly engaging with political and or moral questions in Islamic law, or that at least it seeks to address such questions in a very different way via very different means. The point about Islam's wider scope of concerns with the basic argument of N.J. Coulson, the scholar that Wael Halak really sort of criticized in his earlier works, who argued that Sharia has in fact a much wider scope and purpose than the simple legal system in a Western sense of the term. Coulson argues that, quote, jurisprudence not only regulates in meticulous detail the ritual practices of the faith and matters which can be classified as medical hygiene or social etiquette, legal treaties, indeed invariably deal with these topics first. It is also a composite science of law and morality whose exponents, fuqaha, are the guardians of the Islamic conscience, end quote. Many of the questions that liberal law seeks to punt back to other political actors or government bodies, Islamic law, at least in principle, seeks to directly confront by its Sharia-rooted discursive legal framework. The chapter concludes that when properly actualized, an Islamic legal discourse would never completely absolve itself from considering questions of goodness or soundness when offering a legal decision, which does happen in Western courts. And I give the example of the Donald Trump's presidential proclamation 9625, known as the Muslim ban, is an example of this, in which the courts literally said, we don't even know if we agree with this. It probably is wrong, but it meets the legal standards of justifiability, therefore it's acceptable. I don't think you'll find many Islamic judges who are going to say, well, this is not what God really wants, but it fits in with the basic standards of the system, so we're going to do it anyways. Right? That's sort of the point I'm trying to make. When taking this matter seriously, it means that Islamic laws have certain restrictions that are not present within liberal positive law from the start. This is even the case in Islamic courts, in the Islamic court setting. Justice is an explicitly divinely ordained requirement in Islamic court, while the specific contest iterations of liberal positive law have their own foundational sources as well, such as secular constitutions or man-made human bills of rights or bills of rights. These foundational sources are inherently malleable and are subject to change. Just as Oliver Wendell Holmes at the beginning of the 20th century commented in the court case of Southern Pacific versus Jensen that, quote, the common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky. Rather, it is the articulate voice of some sovereign or quasi-sovereign that can be identified. This seems clear in Holmes's assessment, but there is no room for God when articulating or even thinking about modern common law. In his words, once again, quote, common law is always the law of some state, end quote, which means it is always laws made by man for man. The Islamic legal approach simply is no longer Islamic and becomes little more than a historical artifact when its foundational sources are no longer taken seriously. Or to put it even more bluntly, to drawing from Oliver Holmes's words, Islamic law can never be fully and properly conceptualized without recognizing that, quote, brooding omnipresence in the sky, or in other words, God, right? And when we talk about the speed of change in liberal societies, it's so much different than in Islamic societies. You know, most of you guys, if you're in college still or in your late teens, early 20s, and for most of your lives, at least in the West, LGBT marriage or gay marriage, whatever you want to call it, has been allowed. And but this was completely unthinkable even in the 1980s and 1990s, right? In the 1990s in the United States, there was a policy called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" because it was still illegal to be gay in the military. So if you were in the U.S. Armed Forces and you were gay, you would be expelled. And Bill Clinton radicalized with this policy of "Don't ask, don't tell." So you couldn't ask somebody if they're gay, and you couldn't tell anyone if you're gay. And if you went that way, everything would be, no one would bother you, right? So, like, you know, in today's climate, that would be completely crazy, right? Because gays, transgendered, everybody can serve in the military now, right? So we see a major transformation of a social norm in less than 25 years. I don't think you're going to see this kind of change within Islamic legal principles ever on any issue, especially one as polarizing and controversial as LGBT marriage, right? So this is what I mean by the speed of change can happen very quickly because the sources are not rooted in something immutable, right? These are man-made laws made by man for man that seem reasonable at the time, and Sharia is something that transcends that to some degree. All right, so moving close to the end here, guys, I promise. Chapter 8, well, I hope the first 7 chapters offered the reader something and provided valuable insights. I feel more work can be derived, more benefit can be derived from my work, and perhaps even a future book by looking at a mode of discourse that, in my opinion, does appear to offer more possibilities within which to conceptualize Islam. If one is to offer what amounts to mostly a critique of something, then I feel that they are obliged to at least try to offer something positive in this place. Therefore, this concluding body chapter introduces the possibility of what is widely understood as communitarianism as a more suitable alternative discourse for rethinking novel forms of Islamic social and political organization in the 21st century. This chapter first offered a working definition of community, followed by the definition of communitarianism. It then went on to lay out the main communitarian critiques of Rawls's position, as well as the communitarian and Islamic contentions that secular liberal individualism ultimately is a self-defeating enterprise. The final part of this chapter looks in greater detail at what virtue ethics can potentially offer for novel conceptualizations of Islamic modes of social and political organization. The ultimate aim of this chapter was to show that communitarian discourses offer more possibilities for meaningful engagement with Islam than do comprehensive or political liberalism. It seeks to open the door to further scholarly inquiry and engagement between between Islamic and communitarian discourses. A successful Islamic polity is dependent upon some shared notion of Islamic moral agency that is ultimately rooted in Quranic values. In the end, moral agency is developed as a communal value in any society, religious, secular, or otherwise, only when people actively participate in civil society, something that sadly is lacking in much of today's Muslim world, in which autocrats either create fake civil societies that aim to mimic authentic civil society in external form but not in internal content, or they just stifle it altogether, which has become sort of the trend in many of the Gulf states. The lessons that ought to be drawn from what is happening in both the United States and the EU as a result of failed neoliberal social and economic policies and the rise of reactionary right-wing fascist thought, along with useful insight offered by communitarian scholars such as Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, even Michael Sandel, offer valuable food for thought for offering novel conceptions of Islamic political and civil society. The rise of radical individualism in recent times in the West has morphed into full-blown selfish egoism and the complete lack of concern for the well-being of others, perhaps best illustrated by the absurd politicization of mask wearing that has emerged during the COVID-19 crisis in the United States. This is a challenge that communitarian theorizing may be better suited to address. Nonetheless, since morality ultimately is something developed within the individual, in the end, the final decision to embrace and operationalize moral agency remains a uniquely individual choice. However, this process of coming to terms with moral agency and moral autonomy is one that is intimately connected to one's communal settings. A society that prioritizes positive communal bonds is bound to produce a different moral agent than a public conceptualization of moral agency that does not. The prioritization of communal bonds does not necessitate denigrating into politics of sectarianism or exclusion either. Drawing once again from Islam's moral historical resources to draw from Wael Halak's words, further scholarship should aim to create modes of political discourse in which the Islamic part of Islamic societies remain at the forefront, which at the same time offer reasonable accommodations for non-Muslim citizens to participate in social political processes and enjoy a maximum range of their own individual liberties and freedoms. This is the only way to ensure social harmony and political stability in an increasingly diversifying world. Which finally leads me to my conclusion. Drawing from what Fred Dallmeyer argued, the essence of comparative political theorizing ought to do, this book aimed to rekindle that critical elan endemic to political philosophy by showing how relevant this discussion on Islam and liberalism is today, with the hope that it would open new doors for novel lines of inquiry that can be further developed. It did so by engaging with the claims of different authors and texts on their own terms, with the hope that readers would be able to judge for themselves where congruencies between Islam and liberalism can be found, and how meaningful these congruencies are. Obviously, there were many different ways to approach this project. However, the main goal of this work was to present all the material and arguments in a fair-minded and reasonable manner that would benefit readers coming from a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds and professional levels of expertise. This book was also written with an agenda, a partial rejoinder to the recent wave of what can only be described as uninformed nonsense coming from many different voices that represent both sides. Those interested in comparing and contrasting Islam and liberalism sadly often seem to be more interested in pushing an agenda to promote either or than anything else. With relatively few exceptions, scholarly rigor is generally eschewed in favor of catchphrases and gross generalizations. On one side, you have nonsense coming from classically trained Islamic scholars, as well as proponents of Islamic modes of social organization, who could even tell you who John Rawls or Judith Shklar even were, but nonetheless have the utmost confidence that they know what modern liberalism really is all about. Many of these voices have reduced an expansive discourse to gripes about external policy manifestations on hot-button social and economic issues that ironically are often more socialist than liberal in the classical sense of the term. On the other hand, there's an equally voluminous amount of nonsense coming from partisan, Western educated liberal voices. Many of these voices do not even know the difference between the mutaghayirat and the thawabit injunction, but without hesitation will tell you who Quran 951, the controversial so-called sword verse, really applies to, right? While we are all familiar with certain figures in politics and the media doing things like this also even happens in academic settings, most often in debates related to democratic transitions in developing countries. These are the individuals who often reduce authoritarianism and corruption in the Muslim world to spurious cultural claims based on miscontextualized references that are often cherry-picked from Quran translations. The conclusion chapter first recounts three major undercurrents of the work. Right? One, the difference in how Islam and liberalism have thus far understood the interaction of the dini and the dunyawi, with explicit reference to Hussein Abbasi's 2020 article that talks about this. I highly recommend this article. Two, how alien the notion of secularism historically has been within the Islamic mindset and Arabic language more generally. And three, the inextricability of Enlightenment liberalism from political liberalism. The two are simply inextricable. He then goes on to briefly articulate some of the practical real-world implications of Russian liberal reforms on illiberal societies, with a focus on modern Saudi Arabia for a couple paragraphs. It closes with an appeal to toleration and mutual respect, constructs that are readily present within both Islam and liberalism, as the only way for us to maximize our own collective security and collective happiness in this world. Further fine-tuning what toleration actually means, what its limits are, and how it can be realized will need to be further dissected by policy scholars, policymakers alike. In the meantime, however, at the individual level, we can and must take it upon ourselves to further explore and engage with the notions of toleration and pluralism that are inherent within our own self-subscribed, comprehensive, and political doctrines. In the end, moral progress is ultimately made at the individual level. I've repeated this point because I believe it's true. And this begins by recognizing everyone's inherent moral worth. We are all products of God's creative hand. It means treating all people, so long as they're not openly trying to harm you, with respect and basic decency. This certainly is how John Rawls would have had it. And in my opinion, there's ample evidence within primary and secondary Islamic sources that this would have also been similar to what the position of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have been as well. Allahu alam. I hope you all enjoyed my talk today. I get my change screens here. I hope you guys found this useful. Like I said, it was tough for me to give this talk because of my lack of eating and my dry mouth. I hope you understood what I was saying, and I'd like to open the floor now to questions and let you guys take it. I actually see a couple questions here in the question section. So I guess you go ahead, Ishraq. You go ahead, handle it. How do you want to proceed?
Hello, Professor.
Yes, hello.
Sorry, I think there were a few problems with the audio, but I hope it is okay now. Thanks for your wonderful delivery, and I think it has been tremendously beneficial to all those attended. However, today is the first night of Ramadan for us here in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So people are flocking to mosques for Tarawih.
Okay.
And as a result of that, there is a less turnout than what we expected. So I believe that they would probably watch the episode later on YouTube.
That's
perhaps.
fine.
So I actually had a couple of questions that I would like to ask you here.
Sure.
Hello?
Go yes, go ahead, ask me. I can hear you.
Yes, but I think we are having some difficulties with the audio again. I think it is clear on the front end, but on the back in the back end it is somewhat difficult. Anyways, the question that I have, the first question is that about the last point that you made about toleration and mutual respect that would ensure peace and stability between two camps, liberals and Islamic camps. But given the fact that liberalism is not just about the liberal world or the liberal space, the West, the United States or the Europe, but liberalism is also affecting the hearts and minds of the people living within the Islamic world, especially the westernized and Western educated elites within the Muslim world. So it is not just in the outside, but it is also very much in the inside. How do you think the notions of toleration and mutual respect would ensure that there is some sort of thaw or some sort of ceasefire, if you will, between these two large camps? And given the missionary zeal that liberalism possesses within itself, is it possible for liberalism theoretically to not expand itself into Muslim countries? And I think we can also ask the same question with regard to Islam as well.
That's a very good question. And as a matter of fact, your question you just asked about how can liberals and Muslims coexist peacefully, with liberalism being a totalizing ideology that seeks to swallow up. It was the same question actually that was asked me at the SIGA talk I gave by I think Professor Samuel Arian asked the same question. So you're definitely on the right track. It's a very good question. But I have to make the point again. I'm talking about as individuals, right? Because we see that in our daily lives, we do interact with people that are different than us, right? So in the United States, for example, you have Muslims working side by side with Christians, with Jews, in hospitals right now trying to save people from the COVID pandemic, right? So what I'm saying is possible is that, like, while the structural systems may be in constant clash, and there may be a lot of tension and stress there, I think at individual level, as an individual, I can go up to Susan, the Christian lady, and help her with her groceries, and Susan can then show respect by not disrespecting me or trying to oppress me, right? So I'm saying that what can be done in the meantime, despite the systemic problems, and they are great, and I talked about this in the book, I think that individuals still can treat each other with respect and try to tolerate each other. And we see what's going on in France right now. This is a great example, right? So you have a very nasty situation where the majority population is doing all they can to oppress and not really tolerate the Muslims living there. And they don't need to do this, right? They can show more respect for the lady in hijab, not ban women dressing in certain bathing suit styles and wearing head covering, right? And these are things that I think liberalism, liberal individuals can be more tolerant of. And I mean, this is our only hope. I don't see what other alternative we have, because the alternative is conflict and violence. So I think that everybody can try to show basic respects to people, and at the same time, you look at some of the movements. This movement is the Anjem Chowdhury movement that was going on in the UK, or the Sharia for UK movement. Which, let's be honest, it's ridiculous, and it's doing nothing to help Muslims, and it's not bringing a more stable society, right? All it's doing, what is that? Are they really going to have Sharia in the UK? Like, seriously, is that going to actually happen anytime soon? Like, all this is doing, this kind of baiting, is in the end harming Muslims more, because what does it do? It gets the governments to spy on more mosques, to do more de-radicalization programs, and to put other people who have a realistic way of viewing politics in the UK, it puts them in a bad position, So I would argue that, like, this is what I mean by trying to sort of coexist at this level. And your other question was about the encroachment of liberalism in the Muslim world. And yes, I think that this is one of the major things that is going to be. And liberalism doesn't just encroach in the Muslim world through political actors. It's spread through culture as well. It's spread through movies. It's spread through, let's be honest, women in the subcontinent where you guys live dyeing their skins white to look more like the white actresses they want to look like, even though this harms their bodies. It's done by people mimicking Western dress styles and trying to be like these people. And this is all a part of the liberal neoliberal capitalist model, and cultural diffusers through movies, through music, and through fashion and clothing styles. So all of this stuff will continue to be a strain on the Muslim world. And let's put it this way: you see more Muslim women and men dressing in Western fashions than you would see, a typical guy at an American football game dressing in a shawal khamis, or a women wearing hijab as a fashion statement, even though they're not Muslim, right? So we see the cultural diffusion of values is definitely a one-way street. And this is something Muslims need to be careful of. So what do Muslims do? Well, it begins by building their own cultural traditions, maintaining and promoting their own local arts and cultures, and not allowing their society to be swallowed up by the McDonaldization of the world. But at the same time, I also recognize that all cultures interact with each other, and all cultures borrow certain elements and things from each other, right? So we shouldn't pretend that any society operates in a complete vacuum. But at the same time, Muslim societies can do more, in my opinion, to protect them, to inoculate themselves from the onslaught of haram, Western values, sexual mores, permissivity, and all that stuff. So that'd be my answer, sort of, to that. I saw another question here from Shahidul Islam. Let me just try to answer that real quick here, because it's an interesting question.
So, Professor, I think these are very valid points, but the concern that I have, and I believe many others have, is that the tension, the primary tension that the Muslim world is facing is not with the West as such, but the Western elements, or those who are perceived of as Western elements within the Muslim societies themselves. For example, let us talk about Ikhwanul Muslimin in the Middle East and Egypt in particular. the Morsi government did not have any issue working with Western powers. In fact, Shadi Hamid, in one of his articles, had uh, very poignantly showed that the secularists were much more critical of the Western governments of Obama administration than was the Morsi government and Morsi supporters. So they were happy to work with not only the Western governments but with the Israeli government as well. But they were primarily at odds with the secularists, the liberals, within their own country. So that is the tension that we are facing. So it might be possible, and I understand that, to have made peace with the liberal camp as if it were a monolithic category existing outside the realm of Islamdom. But how do you work out these differences that Muslim societies and especially the Islamists, whom we call Islamists, I know it's a problematic term, but for
Yeah.
lack of a better term, let us just use it that way, have with the liberals?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'll come out and say something very controversial right now. Is that the Morsi regime allowed for too much free speech? To be honest, they allowed for the liberals to hijack the media and to hijack the discourse, and too many people were allowed to basically spread rumors, lies, and misinformation about the regime. And this demonstrates that there definitely any transitioning society has to be careful of allowing for too much uncontrolled speech. And the fact that the Morsi regime was sort of swamped with propaganda coming from Israeli sources, from the CIA, was also fomenting this. I think that they didn't do a good enough job of vetting out these elements that were seeking to undermine the entire structure of the state. And I know that's something that people don't like to hear, but it's true. When a regime is first coming into being, it is in a very delicate state. It's an embryonic state, and these Israeli and American forces, they are very professional and talented at this. And if you look closely, what happened, there was a lot of propaganda and so much misinformation, and the Morsi government had no way to control or crack down on it. They weren't basically aware of it. They didn't prepare enough. Not saying that they should have gone out and been Saddam Hussein and just locked everyone up and shot them, but they should have definitely been more restrictive on what was allowed to be freely flowing on the media during those formative days of the revolution. I mean, let's be honest. This is how any society that comes into being is going to always have a counter force that seeks to undermine it, right? So there has to be some logical strategy towards countering that propaganda onslaught. So yeah, I think that that's one of the things that the Morsi regime failed to do, is they didn't basically root these people out and identify them and at least limit their access to the public sphere to basically destroy the state. But yeah, you make the point that, like, with the biggest enemy within Muslim societies are the other peoples living within it more so than the West, and that's a pretty good point. For these Islamic societies to ever take off, there has to be some reconciliation to some degree, right? Because you can't run any government with half your population absolutely despising you, right? It doesn't work unless you're North Korea or something. I don't think anybody wants that kind of regime. But at the same time, yeah, like politics is about contestation to some degree, and there has to be some level of consensus for any kind of Islamic governance or Islamic governed state to function or to operate. You can't impose it upon an unwilling populace. That's the problem. And so really it begins with bringing people back within to Islam, to understanding the benefit Islam can bring to their lives. And then when these people come into power, running these societies in a way that is just and fair and brings economic benefits, things people can physically see, right? Al-Islam hu al-hal is a slogan, doesn't put food on anybody's table. It doesn't give anybody a job. I always talk about the link between development and stability because it's one of the most clearly established basically brute facts in political science. It's that societies with a certain amount of economic development income don't collapse. And to have economic development income, you need to have industry. You need to have foreign investment. You need to have tourism. You need to have a whole lot of different stuff. You can't just produce oil and sell it to the Americans. That doesn't do anything. That actually exacerbates autocracy. And then when these sultans and dictators and whatever you want to call them, claim to be operating within the mantle of Islam as the righteous ruler, it just makes people not want to follow the religion. People see the failure of the state as a failure of the religion, and that's the real tragedy, right? So in societies that try to be Islamic, that fail and don't provide for the citizens, you start seeing people leaving the religion. This is sort of what's happened in Turkey, right? As the Erdogan regime has, gone under some very difficult times in recent years. Religiosity in Turkey is the lowest it's been in a long time. And the same can be said with Iran, Iraq. Like, if you look at the numbers of these Arab barometer surveys prior to the Arab Spring, Arab revolutions, and after, the level of religiosity, I'm not talking about supporting political Islam, I'm talking about considering yourself a devout Muslim, has dropped almost across the board. In every one of these countries except Yemen, which is interesting. But it actually makes sense because Yemen's in the middle of a horrendous civil wars where people really are clinging to the religion tighter, right? It's all they got. Literally, they don't even have food there. So there's all these different social dynamics there. But I would argue that, and this is, I'm writing a commentary on Andrew Marx's book, and one of the things I'm arguing that is, to theorize about any type of Islamic governance of any sort, I think there's certain prerequisites that have to be met before any success will ever happen. These states have to modernize, and they have to provide better education, better security for their citizens, and better opportunities. Otherwise, you're setting up the Islamic governed state to fail from the start. It doesn't even have a chance. Morsi did not have much of a chance, but it was completely crushed within a year because they made a lot of mistakes as well. I know people who worked in that government, and they all told me the same thing. Nobody knew what to do. It was a very good protest. Ikhwan is a very good protest movement. But like most protest movements, when they came into power, they had no idea what to do. Right? So yeah, I don't know that's the best I can answer your question. I don't really have a solution for this problem of I guess you want to say internal enemies.
But I think I'm going a little bit off track here. But the suggestion that you are making is, if we somehow are able to provide the citizenry with the goods and services that they want, provide them economic stability, and they will remain within the fold of Islam. That sounds all good, but I think we need to keep in mind that although in recent years modernization theory has been critiqued very severely by scholars of all fields of study, but I think the modernization and the vices that it begets are not so trivial. If we look closely, and I think it still holds water, that the Islamist movements, they still have a greater following among the poor than among the elites. And economic stability may not. This is a possibility that I am willing to explore, and I'm not claiming absolutely here anything, but it is a possibility that if you deliver them greater economic stability and prosperity, they might not actually be grateful to you, but will eventually leave the fold of Islam because the rise of post-industrial values and indulgence in worldly affairs, as has been mentioned in Quran and Hadith, the effect of it. So Islam obviously does not say that we have to leave dunya definitely for deen, but it is also not just about social justice, because if it were about social justice, then we could have gone to Europe and live a very happy Islamic life. But that is not all. It is much more than that. So how do you deal with that? And also the global forces, the global capitalist forces, and the geopolitical situation with regard to Muslim powers. It is perhaps it is justified to say that it will never be possible for an Islamicate government or Islamist or even pro-Islamist parties to retain power to deliver the goods and services that the citizenry wants without compromising on its ideals, without compromising on its goals, be it the AK party in Turkey, the Iranian government, or the Morsi government, or whatever that is. So how do you respond to that? And I know I'm going a bit off track here from the political theory that we are discussing.
I mean, these are very difficult questions to answer, to be honest. But like, I mean, yes, you are correct in the sense that, like, you know, when people sort of enter more luxurious lifestyles, they sort of lose touch with the deen. We know this to some degree. But I mean, you know, in many parts of the world, there are people barely even able to eat, and I don't think any of them want to continue staying in the situation they're in. So it's not about bringing everyone to like glamorous luxury Kardashian lifestyle like the people you see on the TV. It's about just getting people basic services and having jobs that are safe and that are able to provide enough for the family, right? Like, you know, your religiosity also takes a hit if you're too poor, right? I believe there's hadith that talks about you don't want to be too rich or too poor, because if you're too poor, you can't practice the deen either, right? Because if you're so poor, you can't properly read Quran. You can't even learn. You don't get education. You don't have the ability to sit down and do. You're constantly working just to feed yourself, and you're going to eventually potentially have to resort to crime and other things that are bad, right? So too much poverty is never good, right? Yeah, I mean, as for these Islamic parties, you know, the possibility, you know, Islamic government, it might not work. Like, I'm not coming out to say that it's a guaranteed success. And that's why I'm not trying. I was just trying to argue my first book basically for like a way to possibly conceptualize it, right? Because putting this stuff into practice, there's so many different factors that you mentioned. But you know, yes, Islam is not just about social justice. That is correct. But at the same time, justice is a major part of the religion, right? The prophets, the creation of the early Islamic society was a reaction against not just the idolatry of the Meccan society, but also against the way they treated people. It was a critique of the cultural norms and values. And the prophet immediately made major societal changes. It wasn't just about believe this, believe that, pray like this. There were major social dunyawi changes. So I don't think we can lose touch that they're both important in Islam, right? You can't just have a society that is very unjust, but everyone prays 5 times a day. That's not the point either, right? So I think it's about balance, right? And I think balance is one of the recurring themes throughout all philosophy. It's about finding a balance. And it's about Islamic education. It's about teaching people they don't need all this excess. They don't need all this luxury. You're right. There is, you know, everyone wants to eat and have a safe place to sleep and a place to work. But at the same time, you know, the consumerism, the feeling your life is defined by how many cars you own or how many houses you have. These are things that Islamic teachings can help teach kids that this isn't necessary. But you're right, it's the powerful force of secular liberalism impinging upon developing societies is a very serious threat. There's no denying that. But at the same time, we have to realize it's going to happen. It's not going to disappear. You can't ban it. You can't block it. It's going to be there. This is a matter of, are you going to be able to confront it? Are you going to be able to see all this stuff and say, I don't need that. I'm good with my religion and with my family. And that's really about moral education of the individual. Once again, it comes down to the individual. That's the best way I can answer that question. It really doesn't have a very easy answer, to be honest. But it's a great question. Do you have any other questions or any other things?
So thank you. Although it doesn't answer my question, I think it raises an important issue to not just our audience, but through you, the global audience as well. Anyways, I think we have another very important question that needs to be addressed. Whenever we talk about ontology and epistemology, to the layman, they often find it very difficult to understand what these terms stand for. Even the Islamists again, a very problematic term to use, but again, for the lack of a better term, I'm using it anyway. Even they do not understand the terms very well. Some might understand what it entails without knowing that they are actually referring to these concepts. But um, just to clarify to them, could you please help explain what ontology is? What do you mean by ontology? And if possible, also the epistemology.
Sure. So when we're talking about ontology, the word ontology simply means to study that which exists. What is there, right? So the ontology of Islam, an ontology of something, is to talk about all that exists within that particular discourse, right? So an ontology of Islam would be all the different elements that make up the thing that we call Islam. So ontology means what exists. Epistemology relates to how do we come to know things? How do we arrive at knowledge, right? There's an entire subfield in philosophy called epistemology, right? And it can get quite complicated. There's many different approaches to it. So like when we're talking about moral epistemologies, how do we come to know moral truths? That's what it is. How do we have, what is moral knowledge? So how do we approach understanding and knowing what morality is? So that's what we mean by like a moral epistemology, all right? So the two terms are pretty closely related. Ontology is more overarching, right? Because it refers to all that exists. And epistemology specifically refers to like how we acquire and understand things, how we come to know something, right? And this was discussed by the ancient Greeks. And political ontology has become a more relevant field in recent decades. And political, moral epistemologies and comparative moral epistemologies as well has become more and more relevant in a society in which we have more people in contestation about what those values are. Is LGBT good or bad? Why? Yes or no? Because I feel like it, that's not an answer, right? You have to justify it to something, right? So how do you justify, is this practice good or bad? Well, you refer to some kind of source. You refer to some kind of discursive argument, right? So how do we come to know that human rights are in fact good or bad? And some have argued natural law. Some say we learn these things through our own experience, and there's many different dimensions to that. So that's really sort of the really elementary introduction to these two terms: ontology, what exists; epistemology, how we come to know something. What is knowledge? Matt, are you there?
So I think we are almost towards the end of our today's session. However, I do have one comment
Sure.
that I hope would help our audience better understand what is at stake here today. We can illustrate this point by invoking one example. In recent days in France in particular, we have seen how the hijab debate and the burqa, the veiling debate has evolved. And within the Muslim societies and also in the West as well, we have seen that women now do not veil out of their devotion to religion simply, but by resorting to the choice discourse. It is not something that our sisters practice just because they are Muslims, but because they also, what they say, agency. They have this agency. They exercise their agency when they veil. But the recent debate in France has shown that even when you exercise agency, that is not your agency, but it is somehow imposed on you, because the practice itself is ultimately, in their view, oppressive. So, as the students of political ideologies know very well, that liberalism doesn't allow for one to willingly uh, uh, or to freely choose to enslave oneself. So you cannot choose to not choose. And this, according to the liberal position, is what happens when women choose to wear veil. So ultimately, the choice discourse doesn't help us get rid of the presumption that underlies the fact that veiling is ultimately oppressive practice. Right? So this is the very fundamental moral judgment, and I think this is what Professor here refers to as ontology. So it doesn't negate the assumptions that we have about good and bad. So that is still there, and we still have that. Okay, even if using choice discourse, if some women choose to wear veil, it is still oppressive, and somehow maybe we need perhaps more tolerant and respectful manner to get rid of that. But the assumption is still there, and this is not going to just evaporate into thin air. We have to deal with that. So this is the very fundamental ontological differences in my understanding between liberalism and Islam. So, Professor, the one last thing that in recent years we have, and I think this also relates to the comment that I am making. I hope, please correct me if I'm being wrong here. So, in recent years in Bangladesh, we have seen this trend that there has been some sort of consensus among those educated or creative Islamists that political Islam as a political project has failed, and we need to move beyond that. So many are advocating for what we can probably call secular or liberal Islam, in a sense that is perhaps similar to what Locke did to Christianity, stripping Islam of its religious garb and make it secular, make it amenable to a liberal secular mind. So do you think that is going to work? How does it conform to Islamic theology that makes Islam distinct from other religions by uh, arguing that other religious practices have been desacralized, have been distorted by their practitioners, perhaps in this way, while Islam is purified because it won't be secularized. Will not. It will not be deceptive. It will be very unambiguous in what it claims, and also in terms of practical outcomes. Do you think it would replicate the results or the successes that the AK party in Turkey has had, perhaps not in recent years, but from 2002 to 2016, maybe?
Well, I think that basically Islam is unique in the sense that I don't think it will ever be able to. We call this cultural Christianity, right? That's the term we use in the West. It's cultural Christianity, where you say you're Christian, but you don't really do any of the stuff that traditional Christians do, right? You don't follow the Bible per se, but you just sort of like saying you're Christian. I don't think that will ever really happen. I mean, some are trying to make this happen in Islam, turning Islam into an identity like that, like, Western kind of identity rather than a religious discourse, which is very problematic. But I think Islam will continue to resist this. I think the long-term trend is not towards secularization within the religion. I think the religion itself has been changing in many ways since the very beginning, right? There's been the development of the four madhab within Sunnism, and so we have to understand that Islam is a dynamic discourse. It's not something that's fixed at some point in time and hasn't changed. That's actually the Orientalist perspective on Islam, that it's some kind of static final blueprint for, as Clifford Geertz argued, offers a final blueprint for everything, which simply isn't quite the case. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, you're going to continue to see this tension and this stress between the way secular liberal norms press upon Islamic society and Islam, and it's going to continue to be a tension that isn't going to resolve itself anytime soon. And I'd like to just comment on the thing you said about liberalism and the veil, because I think there's a slight misunderstanding there. If you actually look at liberalism very closely, if it's about truly maximizing personal autonomy and individual agency, the women should be allowed to veil because it's their own right to veil, right? That's what the liberal would actually argue. But we see, though, this tension is more so at the level of state ideology versus individual rights, the character of the state versus the individual autonomies, right? So what France is sort of doing is they're undermining the entire liberal notion of autonomous choice. in the name of something that's very illiberal, which is the right of the state to operationalize its state ideology and its way of life. So I would say that this is sort of an example of how liberalism, when you see the conflict at the state level and the individual level, you see what ultimately takes precedence, and it's the state's will, right? So, because if you were truly following Joseph Raz or some kind of perfectionist liberal argument that really is about maximizing moral autonomy or autonomous agency, then people should be able to dress however the heck they want, right? They should be able to run around naked or wear a hijab, whatever they choose, right? So, I don't think it's liberalism's fault that I don't think like the essence of liberalism means women shouldn't wear hijab because it's oppressive. I think that's a state interpretation of French laicism, which I don't think itself is a very liberal doctrine at all. If anything, it's quite authoritarian. So I don't think we can blame liberalism as much as we can blame French laicism and the unique French way of understanding its national identity. And France takes symbols very seriously, more so than many other places. So headscarves, religious symbols, religious ornamentation. This is. I wouldn't say this has to do with liberalism as much as it do with the laicism inherent within France's constitutional framework. And that's about all. My mouth is about to stop here. I can't even talk anymore. So I hope you guys benefited from this talk. Thank you again, Ishraq, for inviting me. I really enjoyed being here. This was really a beneficial talk for me, and I hope you guys learned. It's good for me to get the chance to speak to people outside the West. I don't really get many opportunities to travel further east than places like Doha, so it's a real honor and pleasure to speak to an audience here in Bangladesh. And I pray for you guys to get through the difficult times you guys are facing over there. I know things are not easy for you guys right now, but the Allah's help, you guys will be successful, and may Allah guide you guys to success in this world and the next. Thank you. Shrek, you there? Looks like he lost his connection. Shrek, you there? All right. Well, it looks like he sort of lost his he sort of lost the connection. So I'm gonna wait here just another few seconds before I get going. Okay, I'm just looking at the questions. Shahidu Islam, you asked a question here. Many liberals actually argue against choosing the bad and thus infringe upon the right to veil. Yes, I don't think that's what Joseph Raz was getting at, though. I think this is the excuse being made by some French laicists. But I don't know actually if this is what most liberals would actually hold, because this veiling thing is very unpopular. This ban against the veil in the United States, at least, is quite unpopular, just amongst just about everybody, including conservatives and liberals. So I really think it's sort of a uniquely French thing. I don't think we can particularly blame this one on liberalism per se. Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up now because it's been well over an hour and a half, and I know you guys got Tarawih. So Jazakallah khair, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bye-bye, guys. Ishraq, I'll let you close it up since you're hosting it. You could end it how you want. Okay, I'm going to just leave then. Bye-bye, guys.
To host you again.